You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 267, Exodus 7, 1-13. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Mike Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing pretty good, but I imagine you're still in pain because of the NCAA basketball tournament.
Yeah, shout out to my Red Raiders, Texas Tech. We made it all the way to the finals, lost to Virginia. It was a close one. We had it there, and they tied it up with 12 seconds left to go in the game on a three-point shot in the corner, and took it to overtime, and we didn't quite pull it out, but super proud of Texas Tech University, and it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it was exciting.
Yeah, in case anybody's wondering, no, I did not watch the game. I don't watch basketball, but I did follow it, like in terms of the news, and so I knew where your heart was, Trey, but yeah, that happens.
It was rough, but man, it was fun. And I couldn't believe that there's only been one Texas team in the whole state of Texas to win the championship game, and that's UTEP before it was UTEP in 1966. Western Texas or something like that. I'm not sure what it was, but I didn't know that, and that was sure would have been bragging rights for Texas Tech if we would have pulled that out. But
well, you got to feel for a day or a few days the way I've been feeling since the start of the Major League Baseball season, because my Red Sox honestly look bad.
Yeah,
they just look terrible. So, yeah. I don't know how that happens. I don't know how you win the World Series one year and then you look like garbage the next, but. Yeah, my thoughts aren't
even
they'll pull out of it.
Yeah, my thoughts are not even in baseball. I mean, we got NBA
I know.
playoffs coming up.
Baseball is to you started. Like basketball is to me.
Yeah, we're in different gears here. But switching gears, we're in chapter 7.
We're almost into the plagues, I guess I'm a plague kind of guy. I've been looking forward to that. We got a little bit of a stop here, Exodus 7, 1-13. We're gonna stop this episode right before we hit the plagues, so almost there. All right, Exodus 7, again, first 13 verses. What we're really going to camp on today is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which in this chapter, it's not the first time we run into that phrase, that language. It has occurred up to this point, but this is sort of, where it kicks in. So I'm going to read the first 13 verses, and there's going to be one thing I want to comment on before we get to the hardening, but that's basically where we're going to be camping out today. So this is Moses and Aaron meeting with Pharaoh. So they're before Pharaoh. First verse says, "And the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Prove yourselves by working a miracle,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So that's the first 13 verses. We've commented on a few things in there already about this confrontation. The one new thing before we get to the hardening topic is in verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet." Now, some people, I think, I'll use the word foolishly, presume this wording means that Elohim are men. In other words, they'll use this verse as a justification for the notion that, well, see, Elohim can be people, and then we take that back to Psalm 82, blah, 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 blah. Of course, we never turn to Psalm 89 where the divine council is in the skies. You don't have a bunch of men ruling the nations in the skies. Again, we forget about Psalm 89 and other passages, but again, we know the drill here on the podcast. Again, if divine council stuff is new to you, watch the videos on the podcast website where it says if you're new, start here. Go to my website, thedivinecouncil.com, and you can get up to speed there. This verse doesn't support that notion at all. That's not the point at all. Moses is not really an Elohim. The point is one of analogy. Okay, God here is making an analogy for and about Moses in relation to Pharaoh. So, let's go back to Exodus 4. To sort of get the point of the analogy. In Exodus 4:14 through 16, we read this. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Moses says he doesn't want to go, to Egypt. And he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth, or with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. So that's the other part of this analogy. Think of it this way. There's God, and when God calls a prophet, when God picks a spokesperson, God speaks to that person, and then that person speaks to other people. So God has called Moses. Moses is the mouthpiece of God to other people. He is to speak God's words. But what we have going on here is that Moses, again, is speaking to who? Well, it depends on the passage. When Exodus 7:1 says, God says to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. It's as though Moses is sort of in the God slot. And then Moses gives his word to Aaron, and Aaron speaks to Pharaoh. So in Pharaoh's perception, Moses is sort of playing the role that the deity would normally play. The deity would normally tell what the spokesman to say, and then he would say it to somebody else. Well, here what you have going on is Moses is telling, Aaron what to say, and of course Moses is getting it from God, but now we've got this one step removed because Moses doesn't, want to talk, to people, or he can't talk, or he stutters, or whatever it is. So Aaron's brought into the picture. And the whole point is one of analogy. It's not that God says, hey, Moses, you're an Elohim now. No, he says you're gonna play this role. You're gonna be like, in Pharaoh's eyes, you're gonna be like a deity because you're the one dispensing the revelation, as it were, to your brother Aaron. And Aaron will be your prophet, and then Aaron will do things, and say things to Pharaoh. So that's all that's going on here. It's just a point of analogy, and it was something that God telegraphed back in Exodus 4 when Moses just didn't want to go to Egypt. So God has to bring Aaron into the picture, again, as this intermediary figure, this spokesperson sort of figure. That's all that's going on here. So we don't need to, complicate it and say silly stuff. It is really, what I'm trying to say here. Now let's go down to verse 3. And verse 3 again is where we get this line about God saying, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. That's verses 3 and 4. Now, we've already, hinted at this because the phrase, about hardening, shows up in other places. And I had said, we'll get to it. And this is the point that we want to camp on the whole issue. And I'm going to be referencing an article here. I will put it in the protected folder in case some of you want to read the whole thing. Although I think with this one you can find it just, freely accessible online on the internet anyway. But, I'll stick it in the protected folder for newsletter subscribers. So The article is by Robert Chisholm. That's Chisholm, and it's entitled "Divine Hardening in the Old Testament." And it's Dallas Seminary's journal, Bibliotheca Sacra, 153. That's 1996, pages 410 through 434. And the whole article is not just on the Exodus passage. It's on some other Old Testament instances where we get the same language, but we're basically going to just focus on Pharaoh here because we're doing this through Exodus. So Chisholm writes at the beginning of his article, he sort of sets the whole subject up this way. So Chisholm writes in his introduction, "The Old Testament sometimes pictures God as hardening the human heart or spirit. The plague narratives recorded in the book of Exodus attribute Pharaoh's obstinance, at least in part, to divine hardening. Deuteronomy 2:30 and Joshua 11:20 speak of divine hardening in the context of Israel's conquest of the Promised Land, and Isaiah 6:9 through 10 and 63:17 seem to indicate that God hardened his own covenant people." Just to stop here for a second, you can see there Chisholm loops in some other examples of hardening, but for our use of his article, we're going to focus obviously on the Exodus material. But we may return to Isaiah 6, 9, and 10 before we're all done, though, because I think that there's something in that passage worth mentioning, again, if I remember it. Back to Chisholm. "These passages disturb many people, for they raise questions about God's fairness and goodness. Why would God cause someone to resist his will and then hold that person accountable for the sin he prompted? In an effort to preserve human moral responsibility and to avoid the conclusion that God would override the human will or manipulate free moral agents like puppets, some argue that the objects of divine hardening first hardened themselves. Others say the biblical statements, because they reflect ancient Hebrew idiom, cannot be taken at face value. According to this latter explanation, the biblical text replaces the immediate agent, the individual, with the ultimate agent, God. God simply allowed individuals to resist his will, but the Old Testament idiom bypasses the human subject and describes what God allowed as if he actually initiated and directly caused the action. A close reading of the text, a reading that includes being sensitive to literary features and genre considerations, allows one, however, to give the biblical references to divine hardening their full force, while preserving human moral responsibility. Divine hardening took either a direct form in which God supernaturally overrode the human will, and I'll just break in here again. To me, overrode is a bit too strong, but again, we'll just go with what Chisholm says for this point. So divine hardening took either a direct form in which God supernaturally overrode the human will, or an indirect form in which he used intermediate causes to harden the object. Whether accomplished directly or indirectly, this hardening was an element of divine judgment whereby God exhibited his justice and sovereignty. The objects of such judgment were never morally righteous or neutral, but were rebels against God's authority. Divine hardening was never arbitrarily implemented, but was in response to rejection of God's authoritative word or standards. So that's the end of Chisholm's introduction. And again, for our purposes, we're going to be sticking with what he, where he focuses on Exodus, which is most of the article. Again, if you want the article, you can either find it online, or again, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll find it in the protected folder. So the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, sort of runs the gamut. It actually runs the spectrum of causalities, direct and indirect, to use Chisholm's terminology. And he, in his article, breaks down the data of the book of Exodus into three categories. So I'll give you these three categories. His category A is a group of texts in which Yahweh is the subject of the verb, or some verb of hardening. Okay, and there's 10 of these. So this is 10 times you have texts in which Yahweh is the subject of some verb of hardening. So in other words, God is the agent. He is the one performing the action. So there's 10 of those. And then his category B are texts in which Pharaoh is or at least a subject of a verb of hardening. So that's 3 times. So there's 3 instances where Pharaoh is the one doing the hardening. At least, one of one of the subjects. There's one in Exodus 9:34 that says he and his officials hardened their hearts. So that's why we're wording it the way we are. So there's three instances. And then lastly, Chisholm has a category C in which no source or agent is specifically mentioned. And there's 6 of these. So this would be verses like, Pharaoh's heart was hard. Well, that doesn't really tell you who's doing the hardening. Is it Pharaoh or is it God or something? It just doesn't say. So there's 6 of those that are just sort of neutral. Now, Chisholm notes that Driver, in his sort of old classic commentary on the book of Exodus, suggested that in Hebrew idiom, God hardened Pharaoh. So Driver's one of these writers that sort of angles for some idiomatic language here. And what he writes here, quoting Driver, I'm actually going to quote Driver here. Driver believes that God hardened Pharaoh insofar as he, Pharaoh, hardened himself. But even supposing that the passages mean more than this, we must remember that, especially in his dealings with moral agents, God cannot be properly thought of as acting arbitrarily. He only hardens those who begin by hardening themselves. Pharaoh was a self-willed, obstinate man who persistently hardens himself against God and resists all warnings. God thus hardens him only because he first hardened himself. Now, that's the end of the Driver quote. There's a couple important things in there. There's this notion that God doesn't act arbitrarily, which of course Chisholm said as well. And then, this, again, with Driver's following the trajectory where God hardens people who had already begun to harden themselves. Now, I think this is really important and really worth consideration, but you will not find this point if you only look at verbs of hardening in the book of Exodus. That's an important distinction. I think Chisholm, I'll be honest with you, there are places in his article where he seems to latch on to that. And there are other places where he seems, I think, a bit too fixated on the hardening vocabulary. And maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say that he misses it. He doesn't miss it, but I think the way he sort of crafts his article doesn't allow people to see this as clearly as I think they ought to. So this trajectory is one we're going to follow here ultimately about Pharaoh being, like Driver says, a self-willed, obstinate man who persistently hardens himself against God. Chisholm has a footnote at this Driver quote where he says this: Driver correctly affirms that God would not arbitrarily cause someone to disobey him. And he rightly observes that Pharaoh was obstinate from the outset. It is also true that Pharaoh's obstinance prompted divine hardening. However, Chisholm writes, Driver downplays Yahweh's sovereign involvement in the drama and fails to note that hardening terminology is used primarily of Yahweh's acts, not Pharaoh's, and that the divine hardening both precedes and follows that of Pharaoh. So let me try to look at this in a bit of a different way. Again, we've seen what Driver says, and I think Driver is onto something. Chisholm, again, responded to that. I think he's trying to be fair, but again, I think that Chisholm is a little too fixated on the hardening vocabulary. So let's try to sort of capture a little bit about the chronology of the hardening, because this is going to be sort of, where Chisholm tracks on, how he essentially thinks that Driver is downplaying things, downplaying God's role. So if you actually look at Chisholm's list, and again, you can look at the article. He has, again, these 3 categories we just talked about, and you could use those 3 categories to sort of reconstruct a chronology. As far as a chronology goes, you have the first occurrence of a verb of hardening in the book of Exodus, back in Exodus 4:21. So let me read that to you. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. So this is part of the burning bush episode. God tells Moses what's going to happen. God, of course, can see into the future. When Moses and Aaron are going to go, talk to Pharaoh, God is, just telling them, here's the outcome. Okay, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, we get, in the chapter we're in today, Exodus 7, verse 3, we get hardening language. We get hardening language in verse 13 and verse 14, verse 22, because this, it starts to kick up here. But Moses and Aaron have actually talked to Pharaoh already, and their conversation with Pharaoh was subsequent to, obviously, the conversation Moses has with God in Exodus 4:21. And I want to try to help you understand sort of how I come down closer to Driver than I do to Chisholm, even though they're very close, actually. But I think that kind of the way that Chisholm wants to emphasize God's role, and then he looks at Driver as de-emphasizing God's role. To me, there's a fundamental question here. When God tells Moses in the burning bush episode, he says, now, look, I'm going to send you to Egypt. You're going to have a conversation with Pharaoh, and I will harden his heart. Does that mean that in that scene, when Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh, that when Pharaoh rejects their request, it's at that moment that Pharaoh's heart becomes hard? And it's sort of a fulfillment of what God said to Moses at the burning bush episode. Is that how we're supposed to read it? Now, if you read it that way, then it's like there's Pharaoh just, kind of doing what pharaohs do, and Moses and Aaron shows up. He says, hey, what do you guys want? And they say, well, we've met with Yahweh, and Yahweh wants you to let the Israelites go. And then boom, God steps in, touches Pharaoh's heart and makes it a heart of stone. And Pharaoh says, forget it. Okay, I think that's really dubious. I think that Pharaoh is that guy from the not from the beginning of this, but for a long, long, long time preceding. I think Pharaoh already has a hardened heart, is already predisposed to listen to God. I think he was predisposed against listening to God before God ever even had a conversation with Moses at Sinai. I do not think we can take Exodus 4:21 as sort of a prophecy and then view its fulfillment in their first conversation, which is actually Exodus 5. Let me just read it to you here. Exodus 5:2. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord? Who's Yahweh, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh. Moreover, I will not let Israel go. I don't think that verse, Exodus 5:2, is a fulfillment or the outworking of Exodus 4:21. I think the Pharaoh we see in chapter 5 was that guy years before. So I think Pharaoh, why do I even mention this? I think, to me, it's plain that Pharaoh's heart is what it is long before God ever says to Moses, you're going to go to Egypt and I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So regardless of the chronology of the verbs, okay, the verbs of hardening, okay, and this is where Chisholm is at. He's doing this chronology thing. I think that sort of skips or doesn't pay enough attention to the kind of person that Pharaoh already was. As Pharaoh, he thinks he is the Horus incarnate. Of course he's not going to listen to Yahweh. He's been taught this since he was a kid. Okay, when you get on the throne, you're a deity. I mean, you're it. You're the one that regulates the Nile. You're the one that does this and that and the other thing. I mean, he doesn't have to wait for this conversation for God to sort of zap him with hardness. So I actually think that the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, that's where it begins. It begins with Pharaoh. I think Driver's correct here. Even though if you want to do a strict chronology of the verbs of hardening in Exodus, the first one comes from God's mouth in Exodus 4:21. Okay, but Pharaoh is already in that condition. Again, I think that is a much more coherent way to look at things, as opposed to up until the time Moses and Aaron got into the throne room and asked Pharaoh to let Israel go. At that moment, God, fulfilled his words of Exodus 4:21, and so it starts with God. I think that is a very poor reading of what's going on here. And I'm not saying Chisholm does that. I'm saying that the way Chisholm sort of articulates what he's doing with the verbs again, and then the verbal chronology and the categories, I think that Pharaoh's condition, who he was, it's harder to see it because Chisholm doesn't really ask you to think those thoughts. He doesn't really sort of bring it to the fore as forcefully as he could. Again, that's just my opinion, even though I think the article is really quite good. I just think that we need to be reminded of who this guy was and not just get fixated on verbs and where they fall, if I could say it that way. So Chisholm actually says elsewhere, in the article, where I do think he is mentally tracking on this. But again, I don't think the article just brings it, to the fore, to the forefront like it really ought to. But elsewhere in his article, he makes comments that indicate that what was in play was a lot wider, than again the chronology of the verbs. There's just other things going on. So I don't think he's lost this. I just wish the article would bring it out a little bit more. So he writes this in regard to, in his section about literary analysis. He says, the narrative does not resolve the tension at this point, again, when we're having the conversations between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh. But one suspects that the Lord's agenda included more than just saving his people from slavery. So what Chisholm is going to do here is he's going to go into a literary analysis that I recommend you get the article and look at this, because it really is worth looking at, where he shows how these narratives, the sections of the book of Exodus with leading up to the plagues and then with the plagues, how there's just a little bit more going on than Yahweh versus Pharaoh in this whole matter of hardening. There's a little bit more going on than just saving Israel from Egypt, just getting them out of there. It's just bigger than that. So back to Chisholm, he says, it's revealed later that when God wanted to display his power to the watching world so that all observers, including the Israelites and the Egyptians, might recognize that he is indeed Yahweh. It's Exodus 6:7, 7:5, 9:16, 10 verses 1 and 2, chapter 11 verse 9, 14:4. You get this notion that God is doing what he's doing, not just to extract Israel, not just to win a debate or battle with Pharaoh. He's doing what he's doing, and part of that is the hardening, stringing out Pharaoh's obstinacy. God is doing that not because he wants to play Pharaoh puppet, okay? God is doing that so that the episode cumulatively becomes more dramatic, so that news, the sort of all of the events therein spread far and wide. And so his reputation, God's own reputation, will expand well beyond Egypt and well beyond the Hebrews. He's doing this for the whole world to see, in effect. That's why the Exodus narrative, as it's laid out, this becomes apparent, as Chisholm's article shows you, that Pharaoh's getting hardened and strung along just to make it bigger, just to make it more spectacular, just to, again, so that God can not only prove his case that he's bigger and badder than Pharaoh, but to do it on such a scale that people for miles and miles hear about it. It's to overly dramatize the whole thing. And we know that this actually happened, because when Joshua gets into Jericho, Rahab tells him, we heard what went on in Egypt. I mean, good grief, we know that we're not going to be able to stand up to you, and so on and so forth. So what happens in Egypt does get spread abroad. Again, that wouldn't have happened if Pharaoh would have yielded at the first plague. When he sees the Nile turn to blood, he's like, oh, okay, we're done here. You can go. No, it has to get to the level of the death of the firstborn and the parting of the Red Sea and all that stuff, so that people outside of Egypt hear what happened. And again, God is magnified through this. So again, if you want to look at Chisholm's article, if you're interested in how the narrative itself sort of builds this idea, sort of reaches this crescendo, and I read you the string of verses there that Chisholm has in that little paragraph about God wanting to display his power. That line, or some line thereof, about God wanting to be magnified. And so he strings Pharaoh out again. God basically says, well, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart again so that, we do something else here. That whole stringing along process gets sort of, those statements get seeded throughout the narrative, and it actually builds to a climax. It's very intelligently done, sort of to capture, this building drama. And it's all for the sake of God's, wanting to be known, as Yahweh, the God of all the earth, outside Egypt. So a quick capitulation does not accomplish that. A lengthy, drawn-out drama with a final cataclysmic capitulation and then a final deliverance at the Red Sea, that'll do the trick. News of that will travel. And so that's, again, part of this whole picture. So it's a lot wider than just trying to get Israel out of Egypt and get the people relief and then, show Pharaoh, put him in his place and all that sort of stuff. It's a little bit bigger stage than that. Now, having said all that, I would say as we think about this, again, I've already telegraphed, where I'm at on this. I think Pharaoh was just as Driver described. He's that guy. He is the rebellious. He is the hard-hearted. He is the disobedient. He is the obstinate person. He is long before God ever has a conversation with Moses at the burning bush. The hardness is already resident in Pharaoh before God ever says to Moses, I'm going to send you to Egypt, and this is what's going to happen. You're going to do miracles there. I'm going to wield my power through you, but I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And again, he doesn't just spill the beans as to why he's doing this to Moses. Again, this whole notion of stringing Pharaoh out so that his reputation can expand beyond the borders of Egypt. He doesn't, tell Moses that in one fell swoop. But the point is that God doesn't pick an innocent guy. He doesn't pick a neutral guy. He doesn't pick a guy that, I'll listen to reason. Let me, give me a few days and I'll think about letting Israel go. No, God does not pick someone that would have made a different decision. God already knows what Pharaoh's decision is going to be because he already knows who Pharaoh is long before he ever converses with Moses at the burning bush. So I think it's really wrong-headed and frankly incoherent to say that God just sort of changed this person's heart to make it hard. He didn't. His heart was already there. And God is doing what he's doing to magnify himself beyond the borders of Egypt. So I would say we have the real questions that we need to sort of be thinking about when we read, through the hardening passages all the way back to Exodus 5. We're here in Exodus 7, and as we proceed forward. I think the real things to think about are these. So I'll just number them. Number one, is Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5:2 the outworking of God's statement in Exodus 4:21? And I've already said I don't think it is. But again, just to talk about this a little bit more. Is the response in 5, I don't know who Yahweh is. Who's that? Okay. Is Pharaoh's response the outworking of God's statement in Exodus 4:21? Is it God hardening Pharaoh in Exodus 5:21, like right on the spot? Or is that defiance something that has already taken root in Pharaoh's heart? Again, to me, this is obvious. To me, Pharaoh's already that guy. Now, here's what Chisholm says. Again, just to give Chisholm some credit here. When Moses confronted the Egyptian ruler and demanded that he allow Israel to celebrate a festival to Yahweh, Pharaoh answered, "Who is Yahweh, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go." Does this response mean the divine hardening had already begun? Now, see, it's a little hard to know what Chisholm means by that, already begun. Now, does he mean to ask, does this response mean that the divine hardening was beginning now? Is that what he means? Or when he says already begun, does it mean like Pharaoh's already that guy? It's actually not clear to me in Chisholm's article which one of those he means. I'm just going to read it for you and let you sort of chew on it. Again, if you want to get the article, you can. So he says, does this response mean the divine hardening had already begun? Whatever that means. Probably not, Chisholm says. 6 times after this, 9:12, Exodus 10:1, 10:20, 10:27, 11:10, 14:8. The narrative notes that Yahweh had hardened Pharaoh's heart. In 9:12, allusion is made to Exodus 4:21. Four other times, Exodus 7:13 and 22, 8:19 and 9:35. The observation is made that Pharaoh's heart was hard, and this condition is attributed to Yahweh by alluding back to 4:21 and 7:3, and also 8:15. However, 5:2 makes no mention of God's involvement, and that's true. So it is better, Chisholm says, to view Pharaoh's action as autonomous. Again, I still don't like the wording of that. Again, what does that mean, autonomous? Okay, it means that God isn't causing it there. I get that. But I'd still like it to be clear that Pharaoh's deciding what he decides because he's just that guy. And he's been that way. His heart has been hardened, or his own opinion of himself has been so bloated for years. Again, I just wish it was stated a little bit differently. Chisholm says, furthermore, Exodus 4:21 clearly relates divine hardening to the signs Moses would perform before Pharaoh. That's true. It relates them, whatever that means. Again, all that's happening here is it sets the scene. It doesn't track on the reality that Pharaoh has been who Pharaoh is for a very long time. Again, I hope you're just getting. I keep repeating it, but I want to repeat it for emphasis. I just don't think we can lose sight of that Pharaoh wasn't neutral. Okay, his heart is hard before Moses and Aaron ever show up, before God has ever had a conversation with Moses. This is who he is. Now, again, I think Chisholm is sort of tracking on this, but again, I wish the wording was a bit, different. But there you go. I mean, you can get the article and read through it yourself. It's just if I were the journal editor, I would have said, well, can you throw something in here, or change the wording here if this is what you mean, as opposed to that. I just wish it was a little bit different, so it was a little bit clearer, at least to me anyway. Number two, again, things that we need to think about, is the allegedly deterministic language. This is the language where Yahweh is the one doing the hardening, okay? Is the allegedly deterministic language direct or indirect? That is Yahweh creating an emotional, psychological, and spiritual condition in Pharaoh? Or is he steering the circumstances for Pharaoh, knowing that defiance has already taken root in Pharaoh's heart? So you can have Yahweh be the agent of the verb. Either way, it just depends, what do you mean? And I think people, when they see God as the subject of hardening verbs, they assume the former, that God is creating an emotional, psychological, spiritual condition in Pharaoh or in a person. We don't have to read it that way at all. God is the agent, sure, but maybe what's meant is that God is steering the circumstances so that this individual that God knows really well is going to choose to do X and not Y, because God knows what the response is going to be in this set of circumstances that God, is creating. Those are two different things. The former is quite deterministic. The latter is not. The latter is God acting on his wisdom to put a free will agent in a situation where God knows what the outcome here is going to be, because he knows that person. He already knows the condition of their heart. He isn't giving them the condition of the heart, the hardening. He already knows who they are. Those are quite different things. And again, I just think we need to stop a moment and think about how God can be the agent of the hardening, but it can actually go in two different directions. It doesn't have to go in one direction. Now, this is beyond the scope of Chisholm's article, to be honest. I just think this is something we, as students, need to think about. After all, the first two chapters of Exodus make it clear that the Egyptians are hostile toward the Israelites. But there's a wild card here. I don't want to miss this verse. In Psalm 105:25, let me just read you that. It says that God, he turned their hearts, the Egyptians, to hate his people. to deal craftily with his servants. It was God who instigated the hostility of the Egyptians against the Israelites, his own people. You say, well, isn't that deterministic? Well, you could read it that way. You could also read it this way. Just for example, God sees what's going on in Egypt. He sees his people multiply. He knows that the Egyptians feel very threatened by this. Okay, but God continues to bless his people, knowing that as they grow, as they multiply, as they become a people in Egypt, that is going to instigate the Egyptians to be hostile toward them. But nevertheless, God is doing that. Why? Because God is creating a set of circumstances where the behavior of the Pharaoh, the guy sitting on the throne in Egypt, is going to be quite predictable. It's not that the guy sitting on the throne is like, man, I love these Israelites, and boy, I love their babies. They're just wonderful people, and all of a sudden, he just turns on a dime, like God again has to touch him and turn his like of the Israelites into fear. It doesn't just happen on a dime. It doesn't just turn that way. But this is the impression, I think, that deterministic thinking often sort of puts in our heads when we read certain passages. We sort of assume that circumstances just change, click, like that. And when they change like that, it was because God pushed a button in heaven that says, okay, now I want all the Egyptians to hate the Israelites. There's the button, right there. I can get them all with one button. Like it's not a natural thing that develops over time, just as a result of very human propensities. I mean, this behavior is very human. We don't need God to push a button, okay, and make human behavior sort of turn contrary or turn in a totally different direction than what it would naturally go to anyway, given the set of circumstances. But God, nevertheless, again, is behind the scene. Again, he's the unseen hand in all of this. This is providence. God is blessing his people in Egypt. They're multiplying. And God knows the Egyptians well enough. He knows human behavior well enough to know that this is going to be at some point perceived as a threat. God doesn't have to sit up in heaven and say, hey, hand me the perceived threat button. I'm going to push it now, and I'm going to change the hearts of all the Egyptians because they're really my puppets anyway. Again, this is how deterministic thinking really is cartoonish. I'm just going to be blunt here. I think, again, when deterministic thinking takes over passages like this, we don't realize this is actually what we're doing, that everything would just go on fine until God asked, some member of the heavenly host for the panic button. And now I'm going to change all the hearts of the Egyptians. Give me the button. Click. There we go. No, what you see happening in the book of Exodus is very human. Okay, you're the people in control. It's your country. Okay, you're an Egyptian. It's your country. And these people in the Delta are just starting to get really large numerically. And you start to wonder where their loyalty might be. Okay, because you have an empire. And when you have an empire, you know that people are out to undo it. People are going to act in self-interest. Well, I mean, we've got masses of people up here in the Delta. What happens if one day they just decide, we don't want to do these jobs anymore? Again, these are very human impulses in very human circumstances with very predictable human propensities and behaviors and thought patterns. You don't need to make God look like a puppet master to understand Exodus 1 and Exodus 2. But again, this is what we get. We get hardening language, and we strip the humanity right out of it. These people are humans. We almost have to make them less than human and again have God pushing buttons to sort of parse the passages. And what I'm suggesting to you is you don't need to do any of that. You don't need to turn God into a puppet master to understand what's going on in Exodus 1 and 2. And God is still in it. Psalm 105:25 says God is still in it. Okay, God knows that by continuing to multiply his people in Egypt, he knows at some point because he knows humanity very well. At some point, they're going to turn. He doesn't need to turn them. They're just going to do it because it's a human thing to do. And at that point, God is going to see that, and he's going to raise up someone called Moses, and he's going to act because God has deemed it is now time. It wasn't before. It is now time to judge the gods of Egypt and to judge Pharaoh. He thinks he's one of these gods, okay? It's now time to judge. See, God gets to decide when he will intervene and judge evil. God gets to do that because he's God. And that brings us to the third thought, again, to think, is God allowed to directly harden someone for the purpose of judgment? I mean, let's say that I'm not suggesting that the hardening starts, with God. I've already told you I don't think it does. I think Pharaoh's just that guy. But if God wants to string Pharaoh out, okay, is God allowed to do that? Again, it's kind of a dumb question. Of course, God's allowed to do that because he's God. But just think with me here. Is God allowed to harden someone for the purpose of judgment? Why would we conclude that the person being hardened and becoming sort of the focus of God's judgment activity, why would we conclude that the person, in that scenario wasn't already there, wasn't already hard? Why would we conclude that? Well, because, again, we're taught to think deterministically in some context. That's why. Why not say that God knows this person, Pharaoh, and the person deserves the hardening? He deserves to get strung along. Perhaps he would relent after one plague or two plagues. Okay, God decides, no, I'm now going to step in and I'm going to harden him. He's already been hard. And again, he's been this guy for decades. We all know who this dude is. But now I'm going to string him along because I not only want to judge evil, I have not only decided now is the time to judge this guy and his wickedness and the gods of Egypt along with him, because the plagues are going to be aimed at the gods. Okay, I'm not only going to do that, but I want to do it in such a way that people for miles around hear about it. We're not going to let this just settle in the borders of Egypt. We're going to take this fight and magnify it. And to do that, I'm going to harden this guy. I'm going to make him resist now. Is God allowed to do that? We can also even ask, can we presume, or might we presume, that God knows when a person has crossed a line? In other words, God knows Pharaoh. It would actually take a divine intervention. It would actually take God changing Pharaoh from a free will agent to like shutting off his freedom, turning him into a robot for a few seconds to get him to move the other way and repent. Again, God is not going to do that. We've already had a lot of these conversations like in Unseen Realm and some of these other things. God is not going to step in and trample on a person's free will, because if he did, that person would no longer be an imager of God. The image of God, being an imager of God, is a complete package. We do not get to say, well, yeah, imaging is a status, and to accomplish this status, God shares his attributes with us. And he shares all of his attributes with us except freedom. Because if we let people have human free will, then that ruins our theological system. So we're gonna like pull that one out. You can't do that, because you can't parcel out God's own attributes. God is the complete package. When he shares his attributes with his intelligent creatures, whether it's supernatural beings or us. And again, we have them to a lesser degree. We have life, we have, ability, we have power, we have the ability to think, we have self-awareness, all these things. Okay, these are part and parcel attributes of God. When God shares his abilities with his intelligent beings who are like him, so that we can function as him, as it were, in his place. We can image him. We imitate him. That requires thinking. It requires free will decision making. It requires certain abilities, creative abilities, to do things. Okay, we can't just say we're pulling the free will out of that, because then God wouldn't. It's actually an indispensable attribute, because otherwise we would not truly be like God. God is not a robot. Neither are we. Neither are the members of God's spiritual world, who are also like Him. And I realize it's convenient to withdraw free will for the sake of a theological system. I'm not interested in theological systems. And this is one of the reasons why. I think it's cheating. So, God is not going to go to Pharaoh and dispense with his free will or shut it off for a few seconds, either way to get him to do something. God is going to be setting circumstances, knowing if a person has crossed the line. I mean, there is a sin unto death, folks. Okay, the New Testament actually does talk about this. There is a point when God will act, and there's no longer the ability to turn around and go the other way. Okay, if God knows that in the New Testament, in 1 John, it has nothing to do with salvation. It just means that you can't turn from your course. This is a sin now that is going to be, you're either going to do something self-destructive and you're going to die, or God's going to step in and judge you, or whatever. There is a point when God knows there is a point of no return for that person. God knows these things. Okay, so we have to give this latitude that God possesses. We have to let Him have it. we have to let Him be who He is. And what He's not going to do is turn people into puppets, now and then, just to cheat, just to game the system. What He is going to do is He's going to engineer and steer circumstances. And people are going to react the way people do predictably. And some people have just already sailed. I mean, that ship has already sailed for them. That is who they are now. And I think Pharaoh, again, with his hardness, his bloated sense of his own divinity, and his hardness against other gods, and basically anything that would lessen his own glory. This is who he is. This is who he is. So I don't think we can really coherently say God is doing something against Pharaoh's will. It's quite in concert with Pharaoh's will, what's going on here. And again, God is creating the set of circumstances with His own people, knowing that His own people are going to suffer, as things start to turn, But this is God's mechanism to, again, call Moses, to send Moses back to Egypt, and to judge the wickedness of the Egyptians. Could God step in and make sure that none of the righteous ever suffer? That's like asking, could God do something where no one ever suffers today, and there is no evil? Yeah, He could. He could just wipe everybody out, or turn them all into robots, and then turn off the electricity, and there we go. God doesn't do that. Again, He has made us who we are. We are like Him. And God essentially plays within the sandbox that God has created for Himself. Because to change the rules would be to sort of admit a boo-boo, or I must have lacked wisdom here. I would have made the sandbox differently. No, God is going to operate within the parameters that God Himself has set up in creating us as we are, creating humanity as humanity is. And God is big enough, again, to get the job done. And we need to trust Him, and knowing that He's not just going to shut off people's free will. People will suffer. The innocent will suffer. The righteous will suffer. But again, if we're believers, this world is not our home. We have to trust the sovereignty of God, that God knows what He's doing. He is steering all things to the end to which He wants everything to go. And in the end, we, the redeemed, will be blessed. Maybe not in this life, but in the life to come. I mean, this is just all big theological stuff. And it's actually all consistent. It does work coherently together, even though it's not always comfortable. What we want is we want biblical theology to work out where we're always comfortable, where we never suffer, we never have pain and things like this. Okay, we live in a fallen world. That's not going to be the way it works. And the only way it can work a different way is for God to undo the image, make us into something we're not, to reverse what He's already done, and then God admits, I made a huge mistake. I mean, again, we have to be theologically consistent. We have to, again, trust God, that things are going to operate the way He has intended them to operate. Ultimately, He's going to get the outcome He wants, but He has to play within the parameters that He Himself has created. And I've lectured about this a lot of times. that God deemed this preferable than to creating robots, because robots can't, there is no free will there. There's that's not the only thing you lose. You lose love. Okay, it can't be genuine if you're a robot. You lose an awful lot the other way. But what comes with it is, again, the propensity for evil, because all of God's free will beings, all of his imagers, we may be like him, but we are not him. We lack his perfect nature. We are lesser. And it's just not going to work out perfectly because we are not perfect. And again, God knows this, but he deems that preferable than to not having us at all. So again, this is big picture theological stuff. Again, I've lectured a lot, on this kind of thing out on YouTube, so I'm sort of sorry for the rabbit trail here, but I think it's essential that when we look at hardening, it's still the same picture. We do not have to look at the text and be driven to God being a puppet master now. It doesn't have to work that way. And in fact, I think in Pharaoh's particular instance, that's really incoherent, because God isn't changing him. He is who he is. And God is steering circumstances to exploit Pharaoh's own hardness, his own condition. And yes, God does harden him to string him out for God's own purposes. And so one of the questions is God allowed to do that? He's God. He can judge evil in any way he wants to judge it. And this is how it worked out with Pharaoh. Another thought. Must we take a direct view of God's hardening as indicative of how God works in every instance, in every person who does not believe or who does not obey? Again, that is deterministic thinking, and it's silly. Think about it. Again, I don't want to, I do want to pick on systems, but I'm not going to call any particular systems out here. But there is a propensity to take what God does in one case, Pharaoh, and say, well, this is what God does everywhere. This is what God does in the heart of every person who doesn't believe. God makes them not believe. He makes them so they can't believe. In other words, we take this one instance, and again, I think, ignoring the earlier context of who Pharaoh is, but for the sake of the discussion, we look at God doing something with one guy, and then we assume that it works this way. God does it this way with every last person who's ever lived. Why? Why do we make that jump? Okay, do you realize if you're in this group, if you have this theological bent, that yes, I'm going to use this verse and I'm going to extrapolate it to all humanity. Anybody who doesn't believe couldn't ever believe, because God had already decided that, and God turns every heart one way or the other way, and that person can't resist. They don't have real free. Okay, if that's what you're going to do, then realize what you've done. Good luck with people who are really thinking about this under your care or in your church, because then you can have someone say, well, I wouldn't have cheated on my wife if God had intervened in my heart and taken my lust away. But God didn't intervene in my heart and take my lust away. So I had to cheat on my wife, didn't I? Really? See, then you're going to have people who want to say, yep, that's true, but we're still going to, then they're going to make some stand on the head argument about you're still morally responsible. Look, if the person can't do anything else, I know you can construct an argument that somehow, in some convoluted way, makes the person morally responsible. But that is sophistry. That's what that is. It's sophistry. And that might sound harsh, but I really believe that's what that is. Because you don't want people to apply your own system in other ways. And so you have to find escape valves. You have to build escape valves into your system. And that's the problem. Okay, we need to get away from systems that need escape valves and so on and so forth, and try to look at how God can be the ultimate agent behind things without, the deterministic thinking. This is just the way a lot of people within the evangelical world think, and they really don't want people to apply their own thinking, their own system in all sorts of ways, but they could, and they would be consistent in their application. It's just a shame. Let me look at two other passages real quickly before we wrap up here. I think passages like Judges 14:4, and of course the old familiar one in 1 Kings 22 kind of help here. Let's take the 1 Kings 22 instance because that's the most familiar. If divine counsel stuff, this is Micaiah's vision, with Ahab, where God has decided it's time for Ahab to die, and the prophet has this vision of what's going on in heaven. God is having a divine council meeting, and the spirits there, the heavenly host, who are called spirits in the passage, are debating. One says one thing, another says another, because God has let them participate in the decision of how Ahab is going to die. We already know Ahab's going to get judged. But God says, okay, how do we want to do this? He lets them participate. So one spirit steps forward and says, I got it. I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. That'll get Ahab to go up to remote Gilead, and then he'll bite the dust there, right? So God says, you're going to succeed. Go out and do that. So God allows, again, in this case, free will beings of his heavenly host to participate in a decision. God knows that the right set of circumstances are created, and Ahab will behave predictably. And God will use that set of circumstances and Ahab's predictable behavior to judge Ahab. Okay? Judges 14:4. This is Samson. It's a little less familiar. I'll just start at the first verse. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Basically, that's who I want. She's pretty hot. Okay. And then verse 4, we have this. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he, the Lord, was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Now, it was from the Lord. If you're the deterministic, God made Samson choose a wife outside of the Israelites. So God made Samson sin, and he did that so that God could justify beating up on the Philistines. And Samson couldn't do any other choice because there's no such thing as real free will. So God made Samson sin, and we know that for sure because Samson could not sin. Okay. It was from the Lord. Why can't we say, God knows Samson really well? He knows how Samson's mind works. Okay? Why can't we have God behind the circumstances of Samson's little trip to Timnah and behind the circumstances of Samson laying eyes on this babe, okay, knowing what Samson's going to do and how that is going to, again, be another little wheel behind a whole set of other circumstances. The wheels are going to start turning, and God is going to use Samson's own decision in a specific set of circumstances to judge not only the Philistines, but to judge Samson too. Because Samson suffers, for his own decisions. He reaps what he sows, but ultimately to judge the Philistines and deliver his people from the Philistines. Why can't we have God, again, behind the scenes, steering circumstances in accord with the propensities of human behavior, which God knows really, really well? And again, God knows Samson is not innocent, okay, here. Samson has chosen a path. Samson has made a series of bad, flawed decisions. Samson's character has been formed by Samson, okay? And God knows all this very well. God can still be in charge of what's going on without going down an absurd and I think, frankly, self-contradictory, theologically contradictory, deterministic trajectory. See, again, this is part of the problem. If for those committed to a deterministic view, they seem to assume that God can't be in charge of things without one-to-one direct causation. And I would submit to you that God can be in charge. God will have his way. He doesn't need to shut off, flip switches. Today you have free will except for a few seconds because I need you to do that. God doesn't need to do that. He will get his way in the end, one way or the other. But again, we sort of assume certain things about how this would work. And I'm just trying to get you to think about, well, do we really need to go down this road when there's this other road over here that might, work just fine, okay? So by way of summary, this is sort of the way, I just approach the whole subject. When God does things, he doesn't do things to make things, to shut people's free will off. In the case of the Israelites in Egypt, he doesn't do things just to make things worse for the righteous. I mean, there's a whole set of things going on, and God is putting things into motion. God creates circumstances. He puts circumstances in motion to vindicate or deliver the righteous through the judgment of his and their enemies. And since we live in a fallen world, the righteous will suffer along the way. That will happen because, again, we're living in a fallen world, but the free will imaging box that we talked about earlier. Again, we could ask, why doesn't God just strike the wicked dead? Why doesn't he just clean house? Well, again, to get rid of all evil, we know what he'd have to do. The consistent pattern of Scripture isn't that sort of behavior. Rather, God works through boots on the ground circumstances. He works through people whom he knows will act and behave in certain ways on both sides. This is the interplay of a sovereign mind and free will beings. God steers people via events and relationships, circumstances, those sorts of things. He does things that prompt the need for the person under judgment to make a decision, and then their decision is predictable. One could ask, why doesn't God try to influence people to make a right decision contrary to their ingrained free will propensity? Answer, because God has decided to judge them. God is allowed to judge evil. Okay, he's allowed to judge evil. If we don't honor if we don't let God be allowed to judge evil, if we don't honor that, if we don't just live with the fact that God has a right to judge evil, if we expect God to steer everyone toward righteousness and repentance instead of judging evil, then we're saying that we are more moral than God. We're saying God is morally wrong to judge sin. Well, if I was God, I'd give them a chance. How do we know how many chances God already has given a person? God is allowed to judge sin. He is not morally suspect if he decides to judge sin. Again, we just don't know what God has been doing in a person's life, and that person has just shut off, God, that they've chosen their own path. God knows the direction of a person's heart, and if he decides to judge them, he will steer the circumstances toward that end, knowing that a person will follow course. Sometimes, God does do something dramatic to invade a person's life. I mean, that does happen too. And that's up to God, to decide. Like Paul. I mean, he directly encounters Paul on the Damascus Road. But here's a question. On what basis is God obligated to do that for everybody? What's the basis for that? And if you say, well, he is required to do that for everybody, then you've just said God has no right and no authority to judge evil. That's what you've said. The result of all that is a theology that says God isn't allowed to judge wickedness. He is. God has chosen to create free will beings. Again, the whole imaging idea. He's not going to reverse that decision. It's his own decision. He did things that way, else he'd be, incapable of creating an intelligent creature, humanity, that's truly like him. God will therefore use human will to set people up for judgment. That's what we learn in Exodus here with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. He may intervene dramatically, which would be a special act of grace for his own reasons, but he's not obligated to do that for everybody, because that would mean that God is, again, not allowed to judge evil. Could Paul have refused to obey the call? That's a debate. How about Moses, though? how can we say that Moses could not have disobeyed God's call? Moses tried to disobey God's call. And even after the burning bush, remember, Moses returns to Jethro's house and God meets him again. Remember that? Moses could have said no, but God, and again, stays with him. Does God have to do that? No, God doesn't have to do anything, but he chooses to do that. He even, again, graciously gives Moses a backup visitation after Moses goes back and returns to Jethro's place. God isn't required to do that kind of stuff for everybody. And not everybody will need it. At any point, we all, think of it this way. We all deserve alienation from God because of our sin. None of us deserve salvation. God is never in our debt. He may choose to judge. He may not. He knows he knows the circumstances. He knows what is the best thing to do for his own purposes. He is allowed, again, to make either decision. For us to judge God is frankly arrogant. It's hubris in every way. God seeks to persuade people to do this or that. He uses other people, again, as his agents of persuasion. He uses a whole, bunch of other things to create circumstances. But God is allowed to intervene or not at his own discretion. And in Pharaoh's case, Pharaoh already was who he was. God steps in to string him out, again, for God's own purposes. Frankly, we should be grateful that God persisted with each of us in the ways that he did, because he didn't have to. Again, God could have just said, all right, it's time to judge. And a lot of us, God did judge us. He did judge sin, but he didn't do it in sort of a final way. There was no finality toward it. But with some people, that happens. Again, God knows the whole set of circumstances of everyone's life. And again, I think the big lesson here is not to presume, and I'm using that word very deliberately because I think it is quite presumptive. We ought not presume that we need or must go down the path of this total determinism to understand what's going on between God and Pharaoh in these passages. We don't. So again, just a caution there, and I hope you will, take a look at Chisholm's article. I think it's really worth a look. And my only gripe with it is that I think we need to just more intentionally think about where Pharaoh was already at. God is not flipping switches in the sky. He is already who he is. And so we do not need to have a switch flipping deity. We can have a deity, we can have a God who decides to judge and sets up circumstances whereby judgment will happen. And also, in Israel's case, deliverance. God is ultimately in control, but that does not have to mean direct deterministic thinking.
All right, Mike. Well, that takes us to our plagues. Any idea how you're going to tackle all of the plagues coming up, or are you going to go?
I don't know. I think I'll probably group them. I just don't know what the groups will look like yet.
We're getting ever so close to the Passover and the Red Sea and all the good stuff. I guess it's all good, though, huh?
All the good stuff. all the stuff we remember from the movie.
Right, the movie.
Right. All the places where we needed a cast of thousands. Right?
Exactly. So I guess Easter's coming up, so they'll probably be playing it on the network. So I'm going to have to see and record it so that way I have it.
Like what the timing is.
We need to prepare some kind of group Naked Bible watch party or something. Everybody on Twitter watching it live together. I don't know. I'm thinking about that.
I've seen it so many times. I still like to watch it. I'll admit it.
I like it. I love it. All right, Mike. Sounds good. We'll be looking forward to the plagues next time. And with that, I want to thank you, everybody, for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.